Well, welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it so much. What I want to talk about on today's program is something that we all saw unfold this last week that I couldn't believe what I was watching. As this Wagner group, this mercenary army in Russia, was basically making a march toward Moscow. And it looked like many people were calling this Putin's last stand. Like his regime was going to be overthrown. And then suddenly, inexplicably, it just kind of all halted. And in the wake of that, everybody's trying to figure out what in the world happened and where's this all leading. So I want to talk about that. Certainly there's a lot of geopolitical repercussions and ramifications to that. But I want to talk about it from a prophetic viewpoint, of course, as well. In a little bit, we'll go into the subscriber-only section. There's a question I have that's been sent in about the Gog-Magog invasion. Why no Arab nations are mentioned? There don't seem to be any of the Arab countries that are mentioned in that passage. Why is that? Another question about, do you have to be an overcomer to participate in the rapture? What about believers who are not overcomers? Will they participate in the rapture? And what does it mean to be an overcomer? And then finally, based on Zechariah chapter 13, verses 8 and 9, will 2/3 of the Jewish people die in the tribulation period before Jesus returns? So some sobering questions, yet some very important questions about our future and the future of the world. So we'll answer those a little bit in the subscriber-only section. But again, I want to go back and talk about what happened this last weekend. I was watching a lot on June the 24th. On Saturday on television. I'm sure as many of you were as well, as the world was just watching in kind of shock and disbelief as this mercenary army called the Wagner was marching toward Moscow. They came within 120 miles of Moscow, and I couldn't believe what I was watching. And I think most of the commentators couldn't. They had all kinds of military experts on there trying to dissect, what was happening, and all kinds of experts on Russia and geopolitics. And then just kind of as suddenly as it all began, it just kind of all dissipated. And we were kind of left wondering what in the world was going on here. Now, just a little bit about this Wagner group. This Wagner group was led by a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he's been leading this kind of mercenary army for several years. This Wagner group, there's a man who's kind of a co-leader of it named Dmitry Utkin. And the name of this group, Wagner, comes from the composer that Hitler loved a lot, a 19th century composer named Richard Wagner, who was a terrible anti-Semite. And Dmitry Utkin, who's the leader of this Wagner group with Prigozhin, loves Nazis. He's a Nazi sympathizer. He wears clothing with swastikas. He'll often sign documents with the symbol of the Nazi SS. But this group called Wagner is a private military company. It's called a PMC. About 50,000 members in this army that were in Ukraine. About 40,000 of them are convicts. So basically they just clean out the prisons and they become part of this Wagner group. So it's a very loosely organized, not as disciplined a group, a very brutal, bloodthirsty group. They've been fighting in North Africa. They've been in Syria. They've been declared by the United States Department of Treasury to be a transnational criminal organization. So this is a bloodthirsty, brutal group that's been doing a lot of the dirty work and fighting down in Ukraine. And what happened is basically a feud between the leader of this Russian mercenary army called Wagner, this man named Prigozhin. He had this feud with Russian military leaders, and finally it festered into basically a mutiny. Now, Prigozhin called this the March of Justice. It's been called a revolt, an armed insurrection, a rebellion, a coup, the beginnings of a civil war. And as this was unfolding, there were all kinds of theories about what was happening that were swirling around. I'm sure many of you heard these as you watched cable news channels or wherever you get your news. Some people were saying that this was kind of a planned rebellion, that Prigozhin and Putin were maybe kind of in cahoots together. And that they were kind of staging all of this to maybe lure Ukraine to maybe take some kind of foolish action that then they could retaliate against. So people had that theory that this was all, planned or orchestrated. Some people still believe that. Other people were saying that, again, this was Putin's last stand, that Putin was finished. This army was going to march all the way to Moscow. He was going to be overtaken. A coup would take place, and Prigozhin then would become the leader of Russia. So all this was happening. And then, like I said a little bit ago, just as quickly and suddenly as this mutiny flared up, it just fizzled out. Kind of a bizarre, inexplicable turn of events. This march just came to a sudden halt. I'd watched the news earlier in the day about what was happening and, got busy doing some other things and came back expecting to see this march continuing to Moscow, and suddenly it was over. We learned that there'd been a deal that had been brokered by the Belarusian president named Lukashenko between Putin and Prigozhin for Prigozhin to go to Belarus and be exiled there and basically have protection. So Prigozhin stood down or backed down, and this coup was averted. And again, Prigozhin then is basically exiled to Belarus. Now, the world has been left reeling in the wake of all of this, kind of scratching their heads, wondering, what just happened and what's going to take place in the future. Certainly, there are going to be major repercussions from this, and it's still, as I'm giving this video today, as we're videoing this today, it's still being sorted out. So there's a lot of significance, but this is also very significant, I believe, from a prophetic perspective as well, in the Gog-Magog coalition of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, what I want to do is just spend a few minutes and answer two basic questions: what we don't know and what we do know. Because there's a lot we don't know still about this, but I think there are some things we do know. So I want to talk about 5 things we don't know, and then 4 things that we do know. And of course, there's going to be a lot of twists and turns and all this as it kind of sorts out, but here's some things we don't know right now and some things we know. So first of all, what we don't know is, why did Prigozhin halt the march to Moscow? Why did he halt this march? They're 120 miles away. Looked like he could have gone on in there and maybe taken Moscow. There's different theories of this. Some will just say he lost his nerve. He realized what he was up against. Maybe he was up against a larger force than he anticipated. Some again say this was all pre-planned and prearranged. So he stops this because it was all arranged with Putin ahead of time to try to gain some advantages. Others, he himself said he did it because he didn't want to kill Russians. He didn't want Russians to be killed. There's another theory that makes a lot of sense to me, and that is that they may have kidnapped or threatened his family. I mean, Russia does this a lot. Putin does this a lot. He'll get family members of someone, they kidnap them or threaten them. They tell the person that, and of course, they're scared to death. A second thing we don't know is, will Putin face more challenges? Has he been so diminished and weakened and permanently weakened that there's going to be more challenges to him? Is this the beginning of the end for him? Are there some structural weaknesses in his government that others will rise up and take advantage of? And do people in Russia now all of a sudden have this idea, well, maybe we do have a choice and we can back somebody else to put Putin out of power? A third thing we don't know is, will Prigozhin stay in Belarus? Will he maybe make another move? Of course, I was watching someone the other day, and they said if they were Prigozhin, they would stay away from open windows. And certainly there'll be, I think, attempts probably to assassinate him. But will he try to make another move? He's a man who doesn't seem like he would stand down in his ambitions. Number 4, will Putin become even more dangerous? Obviously right now he's wounded. He's vulnerable. He seems to feel cornered. It was said when this was going on that there was panic in the Kremlin. Will he lash out in this and seek more extreme ways to turn the war in Ukraine around to his favor? Will there be an increased threat of nuclear war? Is it possible that Putin could blow up the occupied nuclear plant in Ukraine, which many people believe is part of his agenda? We already know that he's transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus, where Prigozhin was exiled. This is the first time that Russia has sent their nuclear weapons to another country. This transfer is going to be completed by the end of the summer. And the Belarusian president, Lukashenko, has been bragging about this, that these tactical nuclear weapons have been sent to his country. And then finally, the 5th thing we don't know, there's a lot more we don't know, but I've just got these 5. Will this push NATO to invite Ukraine into membership? Ukraine right now is stepping up calls for NATO to officially recognize Ukraine and admit them to membership to NATO. Now, that would cause all kinds of problems and escalation, but if that were to happen, that would trigger all kinds of events that could take place that could, again, bring about more stage setting for the end times. But anyway, those are some things we don't know. Let me mention 4 things we know. First of all, we know that this was evil versus evil. Both Prigozhin and Putin are bloodthirsty, brutal, strong men. There were no good guys in this. And we know that Gog someday, this evil ruler that will invade Israel and lead this coalition, we know that he will rise from Russia. And any of these brutal men could fit that bill. But this is an evil versus evil situation. There would have been no winners in this in the world. In fact, Prigozhin may even be worse than Putin and what he would have done if he could have gotten his hands on the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. Second thing we know is this has further solidified and galvanized the Russian alliance with Turkey and Iran. The big three in the Gog coalition are Russia, Turkey, and Iran in Ezekiel 38. And immediately, Turkey and Russia immediately rushed to Putin's defense. They immediately pledged their full support for Vladimir Putin. So this is just strengthening and cementing their ties even further. Number 3, the U.S. is strengthening support for Ukraine in the wake of this. I just read today that there's a new $500 million assistance package from the United States to Ukraine. So we're going to continue to be engaged and escalate our engagement there in Ukraine, because I think America and Western countries are seizing upon this and seeing an opening here to maybe deal a death blow to Vladimir Putin's efforts there. And then finally, the 4th thing that we know is Russia will continue its aggression. They're going to continue to dominate global and world headlines. And the Gog coalition, 4 of the 5 places mentioned in Ezekiel 38 are players in all of this. Again, the Wagner group was very active in Libya. They've been very active there. That's one of the nations in Ezekiel 38. It's a nation of Put. You also have Russia, who's Gog and Magog. Then you have these other nations that are mentioned that are part of Turkey and Iran. So there may be a lot of twists and turns in the future. There certainly will be. But the basic matrix of events that the Bible predicts in the future, the coalition of nations, is meshing together. And all these things we see happening are just furthering that and just connecting more and more of the prophetic or end time dots. Well, let's go now to our time of Q&A. Again, this is subscriber only, so if you're not a subscriber, you can go to endtimes.com, and for $7 you can sign up and become a subscriber and have access to all kinds of great information. And again, I'm going to answer a question today about why these Arab nations aren't mentioned as part of the Ezekiel 38 coalition. Will only those who are overcomers, only a certain group of Christians be part of the rapture, of the pre-trib rapture. And then finally, in Zechariah chapter 13, will 2/3 of the Jewish people be killed or cut off during the tribulation period before the coming of Jesus Christ? So we'll go now together to those questions.